When a nuclear age began, there was no mistaking it. The decision by the United States to drop the world's first atomic weapons on two Japanese cities, Hiroshima first, on August 6, 1945, and Nagasaki 3 days later, was that rare historical moment that requires little hindsight to gain its significance. World War II would end, and the Cold War soon begin. New frontiers of science were opening, along with new and frightening moral questions. As Time noted in the week following the bombings, the men aboard the Enola Gay could only summon two words: "My God." But even as world leaders and ordinary citizens alike immediately began struggling to process the metaphorical aftershocks, one specific set of people had to face something else. For the survivors of those ruined cities, the coming of the bomb was a personal event before it was a global one. Amid the death and destruction, some combination of luck or destiny or smarts saved them, and therefore save the voices that can still tell the world what it looks like when human beings find new and terrible ways to destroy one another. Today, photographer Haruka Sakaguchi is seeking out those individuals, asking them to give a testimony about what they lived through and to write a message to future generations. This is the story of Yasujiro Tanaka, a quiet, humble man who has lived through one of humanity's darkest chapters and still believes in kindness. He is 75 years old, living in the city of Nagasaki, Japan. When the atomic bomb fell in 1945, his home stood only 3.4 kilometers from the hypocenter, close enough for the blast to reach in seconds, yet far enough for him to survive. Now, after many decades of life, Yasujiro looks back not with bitterness, but with calm reflection. His message for the future generation is simple, and he repeats it whenever he is asked to speak about the past. You are given only one life, so cherish this moment. Cherish this day. Be kind to others, and be kind to yourself. To him, these words are not just advice. They are truths written by experience. Every breath, every sunrise, every act of kindness is precious because he knows how easily life can disappear. He was only 3 years old when the bomb exploded above Nagasaki on August 9, 1945. He was far too young to understand war, or fear, or even death. But he remembers the light. He remembers the world turning white, so bright that it felt as if the sun had fallen to earth. He once described it as 1,000,000 camera flashes going off all at once. The next moment there was silence, then darkness. The city that had been filled with morning sounds, children, footsteps, birds, went completely still. Later, he would learn what had happened. The force of the explosion had flattened his family's house. He had been buried beneath the debris, wood, dust, stone, and glass. His uncle searched through the wreckage for hours, calling his name. When he finally found the child's small body, Yasujiro was covered in ash, his face swollen and distorted. His uncle thought he was dead, but the child was breathing, barely but breathing. He carried him out into the open air, away from the smoke and fire, and prayed. Against all odds, the boy survived. In the years that followed, the war left deep marks on the Tanaka family. Strange scabs began to form on Yasujiro's skin, appearing and disappearing without reason. Doctors could not explain them. He lost hearing in his left ear, likely from the pressure of the blast. Even small illnesses lasted longer, as if his body had been weakened from within. His mother, who had protected her children that day, carried invisible fragments of the bomb inside her body. More than 10 years after the bombing, she began to notice small pieces of glass pushing through her skin, shards from shattered windows that had lodged themselves deep within her flesh in 1945. She would look at them with quiet disbelief, then carefully remove them one by one. It was as if the past refused to let go. His younger sister also lives with lasting pain. She often suffers from muscle cramps that seize her legs and arms without warning. Her kidneys grew weak over time, and she must go through dialysis 3 times a week to stay alive. Sometimes when the pain is too much, she asks softly, "What did I do to the Americans? Why did they do this to me?" There is no anger in her voice, only confusion and sadness. As he grew older, Yasujiro began to understand that he and his family were part of a much larger story. Many children in Nagasaki carried scars or illnesses. Some had lost parents, others lived in orphanages. There were whispers about radiation, a word that no one fully understood back then. People feared it but could not see it. At school, he sometimes felt different. Some neighbors avoided the families who had survived near the hypocenter, worried they might carry disease or bad luck. He learned early what it meant to be silent, to keep pain private. But he also learned what it meant to be strong. His mother, despite her injuries, always encouraged kindness. She would say, "We cannot choose what happens to us, but we can choose how to treat others." Those words stayed with him, shaping the man he became. In the decades after the war, Japan rebuilt itself. Nagasaki rose again. New houses, new schools, new laughter in streets. But the memories never truly faded. Every August, when the city fell silent to remember the dead, Yasujiro would stand among the crowds, listening to the bells that rang for peace. Sometimes he would close his eyes and see that flash of light again. So bright, so fast, so final. As an adult, he married and started a family of his own. He worked hard, raised children, and tried to give them a peaceful life, one without fear or hunger. But he rarely spoke of the bomb. Only in later years did he begin to share his memories publicly, hoping that younger people would listen and learn. He realized that silence, while it protects, can also erase history. When asked why he finally decided to tell his story, he said simply, "Because I survived, and those who didn't, they can't speak for themselves." Sometimes, remembering is painful. He recalls the smell of burned wood, the strange red glow that covered the sky for days after the explosion. He remembers walking through streets that no longer looked like streets, filled with twisted metal and silence. Even as a small child, he felt something had changed forever, not just around him, but inside him. He also remembers acts of kindness, neighbors helping one another, strangers sharing food and water when there was almost none. Those moments, he says, are what kept humanity alive in a place that had been turned to ash. His sister's suffering remains one of the hardest parts of his story. Even now, many years later, she still asks the same question. Why do they do this to us? It is not a question meant for blame. It is a question of pain, of searching for meaning in something that cannot be explained. When she asks, Yasujiro doesn't answer with anger. He holds her hand and tells her softly, "Let's live kindly." That's how we show them, by living kindly. Through all of this, Yasujiro has tried to live with gratitude. He often says he has lived a good life, not because it was easy, but because it was full. He learned to value ordinary days, the smell of tea, the laughter of children, the sound of rain on the roof. He believes that every peaceful moment is a small victory over the violence of the past. When he speaks to students or visitors, he never tries to shock them with horror. Instead, he tells them about kindness, about helping one another, forgiving mistakes, and remembering the past so it is never repeated. He says, peace begins inside you. It begins when you choose to care for someone else. Now at 75, Yasujiro moves more slowly. He walks with a cane, and his hearing is weak, but his mind is sharp. He still attends peace memorials in Nagasaki every August 9th. He stands quietly among the survivors, fewer each year, and listens to the prayers carried by the wind. When asked what he hopes the world will learn from his story, he pauses for a moment before answering. "I just want people to be kind," he says. Kindness is stronger than anger. If everyone could see how fragile life is, they would stop hurting each other. He dreams of a world where no child will ever see the sky turn white from fire, where no mother will have to find glass coming from her skin, where no sister will ask, "Why did they do this to me?" For Yasujiro, the lessons of the past are not only about war. They're about the choices people make every day. He believes that peace begins in small actions, in the way we speak, in the way we listen, in the way we forgive. He tells young people, this is the story of Sachiko Matsuo, a survivor from Nagasaki. She was just a young girl when the atomic bomb fell, living only 1.3 kilometers from the center of the explosion. In the final days of the war, the Japanese military police, the Kempe, had distributed leaflets warning of more bombings. Her father, believing what he read, decided to move the family to safety. He built a small shelter high up on Iwayasan, a mountain on the edge of the city. On August 7th and 8th, the family began their climb, a steep and difficult path, especially with children and elders. The air was heavy with fear, but her father was determined to protect them. By the morning of August 9th, her mother and aunt were exhausted and decided to stay home. Her father insisted they go back up to the shelter. "The Americans are always a day behind," he said firmly. When they refused, he grew angry and left for work. A few hours later, the family changed their minds. They gathered what little they could and began climbing back toward the mountain. It was a decision that saved their lives. At 11:02 a.m., as they reached the safety of the barack, the atomic bomb exploded over Nagasaki. A blinding flash filled the sky, followed by a sound so powerful it shook the mountain itself. The city below vanished beneath a rising cloud of fire and smoke. Those who had stayed behind, their neighbors, their friends, were gone. Sachiko and her family survived. Days later, they found her father. He was alive, but already showing signs of what no one then understood: radiation sickness. He developed a high fever, his hair fell out, and dark spots appeared on his skin. He died in great pain on August 28th, just 19 days after the bombing. Sachiko often says that her father saved their lives. If he hadn't built that small mountain shelter, they might have been burned alive or buried in the ruins, like so many others. 50 years later, she dreamed of him for the first time since his death. In her dream, he was wearing a kimono and smiling softly. They didn't speak, but she understood. She knew he was at peace. This is the story of Takato Michishita, a survivor from Nagasaki. He was only 6 years old when the bomb fell, just a boy who wanted to go to the market with his mother. That morning, the sky was clear and quiet. No air raid alarms, no sign of danger. It felt almost peaceful, strange, even for a time of war. But something unsettled his mother. She turned to his older sister and said, "Don't go to school today." "Why?" the girl asked. "Just don't," her mother replied. She couldn't explain it, only that she had a bad feeling. So his sister stayed home, reluctantly. Takato and his mother went to buy groceries. People were out on their verandas, enjoying the calm morning. Then an old man shouted, "Plane!" Panic broke out. Everyone ran for shelter. Takato's mother dragged him into a nearby shop, tore up the tatami mat on the floor, and pushed him underneath. She covered him with her body, trembling but determined. A moment later, light. A flash so fierce it erased everything for an instant. Then silence. The air filled with dust, glass, and ash. The blue sky turned a deep, smoky purple. When they finally crawled out, everything they knew was gone. They ran home, hearts pounding, and found his sister alive. She was shaken, but safe. Later they learned that the bomb had exploded only a few meters from her school. Everyone there, teachers, classmates, friends, had died instantly. His mother's intuition had saved both of her children that day. Now, decades later, Takato carries not just the memory of survival, but the responsibility of witness. He speaks softly, but his words are resolute. Japan is the only nation that has experienced a nuclear attack. We must never forget, nuclear weapons cannot coexist with mankind. At 78, he warns the younger generation not to take peace for granted. Average citizens are always the first victims of war, he says. We must never let it happen again. He prays for peace, for a Japan that will never again lose its sons and daughters to war. And above all, he prays with quiet conviction that kindness, not conflict, will shape the world his grandchildren inherit. This is the story of Sachiko Matsuo, who was only a little girl when the world changed forever. She lived less than a kilometer from the center of the atomic blast, just 800 meters away. On the morning of August 9th, 1945, the sky over Nagasaki was calm. No air raid sirens, no sound of planes. People believed the danger had passed. One by one, families began to leave the bomb shelters and return home. Shigeko and her siblings stayed near the entrance, waiting for their grandfather to come for them. Then, at 11:02 a.m., the world exploded into light. A flash so bright it erased everything, sky, ground, sound. They were thrown backward, slammed into the shelter by the shockwave. For a few moments, they could neither move nor speak. Then, the silence broke. People began stumbling in, wounded, burned, unrecognizable. Their skin hung in shreds, their hair singed to the scalp. Many collapsed right at the doorway, their bodies piling one upon another. The heat, the smell, the cries, all filled the small space until it felt like the air itself was burning. Shigeko and her siblings stayed trapped in that shelter for 3 days, surrounded by the injured and the dying. Where her grandfather finally found them, they made their way home together, but what awaited them outside was beyond anything a child should ever see. The streets were lined with bodies, some half-burned, their eyes still open to the sky. Cattle lay swollen and lifeless by the roadside. In the river, thousands of bodies floated silently, drifting with the current. Shigeko remembers walking behind her grandfather, calling out in fear, "Wait, wait, don't leave me behind." Even now, decades later, those images never leave her. She carries them quietly, along with a single, simple prayer, words she still speaks to this day. "I pray that every human being finds peace." Her prayer is not one of anger or revenge. It is the hope of someone who has seen the darkest side of war and still believes that humanity. This is the story of Yoshiro Yamawaki, who was only 11 years old when the atomic bomb fell on Nagasaki. He lived just over 2 kilometers from the center of the explosion. When the bomb detonated that August morning, it unleashed destruction the world had never seen before. A fireball hundreds of meters wide swallowed the city in seconds. The shockwave tore through homes and schools. The heat burned everything in its path, and the invisible force of radiation spread sickness that would last for generations. Yoshiro survived, but his world did not. Like many others, he lost his father that day. He still remembers what followed. Days later, he and his brothers found their father's body near the factory where he had worked. They wanted to give him a proper farewell, one last act of love in a landscape of ruin. With trembling hands, they built a small fire and placed their father upon it. The flames rose, but the body did not fully burn. The next morning, they returned to collect his ashes, only to find that much of him remained untouched by the fire. Yoshiro was overwhelmed. He could not bear to look any longer. His voice breaks when he recalls that moment. The moment he and his brothers, still only boys, had to walk away and leave their father behind. That memory has never left him. It lives alongside the scars of radiation, a pain that continues even now, decades later. He has survived cancer and countless surgeries, and yet he continues to speak, not out of bitterness, but out of duty. The atomic bomb killed its victims 3 times, he once said, through heat, through pressure, and through radiation. He believes it is vital for every generation to understand what those words truly mean, to see the museums, to hear the voices of survivors, and to remember what happens when humanity loses its compassion. At 83, Yoshiro knows that he may not live to see a world without nuclear weapons. But still, he prays softly, persistently, for the generations after him to succeed where his could not. Weapons of this kind, he says, should never exist on this earth. And so, he tells his story again and again, so that no one forgets, and so that one day, peace might finally outlast the memory of war. This is the story of Emiko Okada, a survivor from Hiroshima. She was only 8 years old when the bomb fell, a child whose life was forever changed in an instant. On the morning of August 6, 1945, her older sister, just 12, left home early to help with demolition work, a government program that sent school children to clear buildings for fire breaks. That was the last time Emiko ever saw her. When the atomic bomb exploded over the city, everything turned to blinding light. Emiko's family searched for her sister for months, walking through the ruins again and again. But they never found her. Her parents refused to declare her dead. They kept her name alive, hoping she might somehow return. Even on their last days, they still believed she could be out there somewhere, living, safe, and unseen. Emiko herself suffered greatly. She grew weak from radiation, vomiting constantly. Her hair fell out, her gums bled, and for a long time, she was too sick to go to school. Her grandmother would look at her and weep softly, whispering, "How cruel, how very cruel. If only it weren't for the Picadon." Picadon, the flash and boom of the bomb, a word the survivors still remember. In the years that followed, Hiroshima was called a city of orphans. Children who had lost their families wandered the streets, hungry and frightened. Many turned to theft just to survive. Some were taken in by adults who exploited them. Emiko says those children carried a special kind of anger, not just toward the bomb, but toward the adults who had failed them. Now, as an elder, Emiko speaks not only of loss, but of responsibility. She reminds us that war is not born from children, but from adults, from choices made by those in power. War is one of two things, she says. You either kill or get killed. And the ones who suffer most are always the children. Her voice softens when she speaks of them. Children are our greatest blessing, she says. It is our duty, our obligation, to protect them. Always. She still remembers the child she once was, and the sister she never saw again. And through her pain, she gives the world a message of love, that no child should ever again have to grow up in the shadow of war. This is the story of Masakatsu Obata, one of the oldest surviving witnesses of the atomic bombing of Nagasaki. He was working at the Mitsubishi factory about 1.5 kilometers from the center of the blast. On the morning of August 9th, 1945, the factory was busy as usual. An air raid alert sounded, the kind everyone had learned to ignore after so many false alarms. A coworker looked up and wondered aloud if another raid was coming. Then the warning changed tone. It became real. Masakatsu decided to stay inside the factory, waiting for the danger to pass. The alarm finally stopped, and for a brief moment, things felt calm again. He looked forward to his simple lunch that day, a small baked potato wrapped in cloth. Then, without warning, the world exploded into light. It was brighter than anything he had ever seen, a white flash that burned through everything. He dropped to the floor, face down, as the factory roof collapsed. Debris rained over his bare back, tearing his skin. For a moment, he thought he was already dead. In those seconds of terror, his thoughts turned to home, to his wife, and to his baby daughter, only a few months old. He wanted to see them one last time. When the shockwave finally passed, he stood up. The roof was gone. The walls had crumbled into dust. The air was filled with smoke and silence, the silence of a city destroyed. He made his way to a nearby air raid shelter. There, he found one of his co-workers, a man who had been caught outside during the blast. His body was swollen and burned, his skin melted and raw. Still, he was helping a group of young students who had also been injured. Through his pain, he asked, "Do I look all right?" Masakatsu could barely speak. He forced himself to answer softly, "You look quite swollen." It was all he could say. The man died 3 days later. Even now, at 99, Masakatsu remembers that moment, the quiet strength of a man who helped others while dying himself. He often reflects on what drives people to war. "I think humans fight because of greed," he says. "If we can rid ourselves of greed and help each other instead, we could live together in peace." Then he smiles gently, as if thinking aloud. That's just one man's thought. But perhaps, if enough of us think the same way, it might one day become the truth. This is the story of Kumiko Arakawa, who was 20 years old when the atomic bomb fell on Nagasaki. She lived in Sakamotomiki, only 500 meters from the center of the explosion, a place that would soon be reduced to ash. Kumiko worked at the prefectural office, which had been temporarily moved to a school nearly 3 kilometers away. It was that distance, that small, unplanned change, that saved her life. On the morning of August 9th, 1945, She and a few coworkers climbed to the rooftop after a brief air raid. The sky was strangely still. Then she saw it, something long and thin, falling silently from above. Before she could even speak, the world turned white. The blast threw them to the ground. They huddled inside a stairwell until the noise and shaking faded. When they emerged, the city was gone. Smoke filled the air. Fires burned in every direction. Kumiko began walking, searching for safety and for her family. She soon learned that her neighborhood, Sakamotomaki, was unreachable, swallowed by flames. So she stayed with a friend for the night. The next day, she heard that her parents had been found in a nearby air raid shelter. When she arrived, they were still alive but badly burned. They died 2 days later. Her older sister had been killed instantly at home. 2 younger sisters were gravely injured and passed away within a day. Another sister was found lifeless at the entrance to their house. In all, Kumiko lost her parents and 4 of her 8 siblings. She says she cannot remember how she survived the years that followed, how she found food, or how she managed to care for her younger sisters. I don't remember, she says softly. It's all blank. Perhaps, she wonders, her mind chose to forget. Some people ask what she saw when she walked through the city the next day. Surely, they say, she must have seen bodies. But Kumiko shakes her head. No, she says quietly. I don't remember seeing a single one. It sounds strange, even to her, but it is the truth. Now, at 92, Kumiko lives surrounded by her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. She takes comfort in knowing that her lost family rests together, their ashes reunited, their names carved side by side. When asked to leave a message for the future, she paused for a long time before answering. Finally, she whispered, Nanamo omo itsukanai. I can't think of anything. And yet, even in those few words, there is meaning. For someone who has seen so much loss, silence can speak more deeply than any message ever could. Still, every morning, Kumiko offers a simple prayer, that her grandchildren and their children after them may live their whole lives knowing only peace. This is the story of Fujio Torikoshi, a man who calls life a curious treasure. He was just 11 years old when the bomb fell on Hiroshima, an age when the world still feels full of wonder and mornings are meant to be ordinary. That morning, August 6th, 1945, began quietly. Fujio had been ill with kaka, a vitamin deficiency, and had taken the day off school to visit the doctor with his mother. They sat together for breakfast, unaware that the world around them was about to change forever. As they ate, the sound of engines rumbled faintly overhead. Everyone in Hiroshima knew that sound, the heavy drone of a B-29 bomber. Curious, Fujio stepped outside into the field beside his home. The air was still. He looked up but saw nothing at first, just blue sky and summer clouds. Then, far above, he noticed a small black dot. A second later, the world exploded in white. A flash brighter than the sun swallowed the city whole. Heat and wind rushed over him with impossible force. He dropped to the ground, then was thrown backward, striking something hard before everything went dark. When he woke, the world was silent. He lay beside a bukasueso, a stone water tank used to fight fires. The ground beneath him was scorching, his face and arms raw with burns. In panic, he plunged himself into the water, but the pain only worsened. And then, through the haze, he heard his mother calling his name. Fujio! Fujio! Her voice cut through the chaos. He stumbled toward it until she found him. She gathered him in her arms as he cried, "It burns, Mama! It burns!" The world around them had vanished into smoke, but her embrace became his shelter. Days blurred together. Fujio drifted in and out of fever and pain. His face swelled shut. His body was wrapped completely in bandages. He was treated first in an air raid shelter, then taken to a hospital in Hatsukaichi. Doctors whispered that he might not survive. When he finally woke, faint light shone through the layers of cloth over his eyes. By his side sat his mother, quietly playing a tune on her harmonica, a soft lullaby from before the war. In that small melody, he felt something gentle and alive, a promise that life somehow would go on. Time passed. His wounds healed, though the scar on his neck never faded. Doctors once told him he would not live past 20. But he lived, not just through years, but through decades. Now, at 86, he sometimes runs his fingers over that old scar. It stings in winter, and sometimes aches when he thinks too long about that day. But he no longer sees it as something to hide. It reminds him that he survived, that he endured, that love can outlast even the cruelest fire. He says quietly, "We cannot continue to sacrifice precious lives to warfare. All I can do is pray, earnestly, relentlessly, for peace." This is the story of Inosuke Hayasaki, a survivor who carries both the memories of horror and the hope of peace. He always begins his story with gratitude. "I am thankful," he says, "for every chance to speak about world peace and the meaning of the atomic bomb." For him, remembering is not about reopening wounds, but about keeping the world from making the same mistakes again. Hayasaki often expresses deep appreciation to those who listen, especially visitors from distant lands. When he met people from the United States, he thanked them sincerely for coming such a long way. "You have traveled far from your country," he said. "Your journey must have been long and tiring. 72 years have passed since the bombing, and yet you came. That means something." He reflects on the world around him today. Many young people, he observes, have forgotten the war. They passed the peace bell of Nagasaki without much thought. "Perhaps that is a good thing," he says quietly. "Maybe it means this generation lives in peace, a peace we once could not even dream of." But when he sees people of his own age standing before the peace bell, hands joined in prayer, he feels the same sorrow rise within him. Their hearts, like his, are still bound to that day. August 9th, 1945, the day Nagasaki burned. 74,000 people, he says softly, were turned into dust in an instant. He hopes the people of Nagasaki will never forget. He remembers how things were during the war. The Japanese people, he says, were taught to believe that dying for the emperor was the greatest honor. "We were told that we must not cry when our loved ones died for the country," he recalls. "We had to rejoice, not grieve. There was no freedom to question or defy such cruel ideas. We could not say a single word of defiance," he says. "We lived in silence and fear. The entire country was starving. Stores were empty. Even the simplest things like sweets or sewing needles were impossible to find. A child might beg his mother for a small treat," he remembers, "but she could do nothing. Can you imagine the pain that brings to a mother's heart?" Then came the day of the bombing. At 11:02 in the morning, a blinding flash filled the sky. The air turned white, and a violent wind followed, crushing buildings and tearing through the city. Inosuke survived, but the world around him had changed forever. Fires raged, and smoke covered the streets. As he made his way through the ruins, he saw people everywhere, burned, broken, and crying out in agony. The injured were sprawled out across the railroad tracks, he recalls. Their bodies were scorched black. As I walked past them, they moaned in pain. "Water, water," they begged. He hesitated. He had overheard someone say that giving water to burn victims would kill them. But how could he ignore their pleas? They were suffering, their lips cracked and dry, their eyes clouded with pain. He decided to act. Nearby, he found a futon burning in the wreckage. He tore off a piece of the smoldering cloth, carried it to a nearby rice paddy, dipped it in muddy water, and wrung it gently over the mouths of the wounded. Again and again, he walked between the paddy and the tracks, soaking the cloth and offering what comfort he could. There were about 40 of them, he says quietly. They drank the muddy water eagerly. Among them, he recognized a familiar face, his dear friend Yamada. "Yamada! Yamada!" he cried out, relieved to find someone he knew alive. He reached out and placed his hand on his friend's chest, and to his horror, Yamada's skin peeled away beneath his touch, exposing the raw flesh underneath. "I was mortified," he says. Still, he looked at me and whispered, "Water." Inosuke wrung the cloth over his friend's lips. Yamada drank weakly. 5 minutes later, he was gone. Most of the people he helped died soon after. To this day, Inosuke lives with the heavy thought that perhaps he caused their deaths. I cannot help but think that I killed them, he says. What if I hadn't given them water? Would some of them have lived? The question haunts him even now, more than 70 years later. He often pauses after telling this part of his story, his eyes distant. We would not be where we are today, he continues, if it weren't for the countless lives that were lost and for those who have carried pain and struggle ever since. He believes that peace is not something that comes easily. It is fragile and must be protected. We cannot let the momentum of peace shatter, he says. It is priceless. He speaks, too, of the soldiers, both Japanese and American, who died in the war. Hundreds of thousands of young soldiers perished because of the greed of the military elite, he says. They were just boys, longing for their parents, their wives, their children. They died far from home, surrounded by chaos. He looks up with quiet conviction. Wars today do not have winners or losers, he says. We all become losers because our lands, our homes, our lives, all become unlivable. To him, peace is the greatest treasure a country can have. We must cherish peace, even if it means living simply, he says. A smile fades when peace is taken away. He often reminds people that Japan once waged war against the United States and later received help from them to rebuild. We must never forget that, he insists. We must also remember the pain we inflicted upon our neighbors during the war. Kindness can be forgotten, but the pain we cause is remembered for generations. To Inosuke Hayasaki, this is the truth of the world, that suffering travels through time, but so can compassion. The ability to live in peace, he says, is a nation's most precious gift. He hopes that young people everywhere, in Japan and across the world, will hear his words and understand what they mean. Please remember, he says softly, our happiness today is built upon the hopes and dreams of those who passed before us. May Japan continue to be a shining example of peace and harmony. This is the story of Ryuga Suwa, the 16th-generation chief priest of Johoji Temple, a man whose faith and compassion have endured through unimaginable loss. When the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, his family's temple stood in Otemakai, only 500 meters from the hypocenter. In an instant, everything vanished. The temple, the town, and the 1,300 households that once filled the neighborhood. The area that had once been a quiet, spiritual community became what is now known as the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park. Ryuga was just 12 years old at the time. He had been evacuated to Miyoshi City, some 50 kilometers away, to escape the air raids. That distance saved his life, but also made him one of many Jinbakukoji, or atomic bomb orphans. His parents were never found. His sister, Reiko, was later pronounced dead. The memories of their voices, their laughter, and the scent of incense that filled their temple hall are all that remain. He remembers the day he returned to Hiroshima, September 16th, just over a month after the bombing. The city was no longer a city. The streets he had walked as a child were gone. Hiroshima was a flat wasteland, he would later recall. I could see the Seto Inland Sea from where I stood, something that had been impossible before. All the buildings that once stood in front of it had disappeared. Where Johoji Temple had once stood, there were only overturned tombstones from the temple's cemetery, silent reminders of the lives buried beneath and the faith that once guided them. The air was still thick with ash. The smell of burnt earth clung to everything. Standing there, the 12-year-old boy who had once been a temple heir could not yet understand how to rebuild, only that he must remember. Years passed. Time moved forward, as it always does, carrying the survivors with it. In 1951, with the help of supporters and local believers, the temple was rebuilt at a new site. The new Johoji Temple rose quietly from the ashes, becoming not only a place of worship, but also a place of remembrance. As Hiroshima itself began to recover and rebuild, so too did the temple, its bells now ringing not just for prayer, but for peace. Ryuga dedicated his life to ensuring that the world would not forget what had happened. At Johoji, he led sermons and lectures, worked with the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park, and organized anti-war and anti-nuclear events to educate the next generation. To him, religion was not merely about faith, it was about responsibility. Within Buddhist teachings, he often told listeners, there exists a story of the Gamayako, a mythical bird with one body and two heads. Though the heads may have different minds and desires, they share the same body, the same life. It teaches us, he would say, that even when people hold different beliefs, their lives are still bound together. If one head harms the other, both will suffer. So it is with humanity. For him, the lesson of the Gamayako was the same as the lesson of Hiroshima, that life is deeply interconnected. To destroy another is, in the end, to destroy oneself. Now in his 80s, Ryuga speaks softly but firmly when he talks about peace. It would be ideal, he says, if we could all learn to dignify each other, instead of growing angry over our differences. He does not raise his voice or dwell on anger. Instead, he reminds his audience, often young students visiting the temple, that compassion is a practice, not a word. Peace, he tells them, is not just the absence of war. It is the effort we make every day to understand one another. For a man who lost everything, his family, his home, his heritage, Ryuga Suwa carries no hatred, only quiet strength, and the belief that from suffering can come wisdom, and from loss can come renewal. Every year, when the bells of Hiroshima ring out on August 6th, he joins his hands together and prays. Not for vengeance, but for understanding. Not for the past, but for the future. He prays that no child will ever again have to look upon a wasteland and call a home. And so, the priest who once walked through the ruins of his temple now stands in a place of peace, a reminder that even after destruction, compassion can still take root and hope can still endure.